Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is Samuel Say. Samuel writes at slowtowrite.com. He is a Ghanan. He was born in Ghana, Ghanaian, and he moved to Canada and to Toronto when he was 10 years old. So he's been living in Canada, is about to move to Ohio. And Samuel has written a lot on race relations, critical race theory, and I don't want to spoil this conversation ahead of time, but let me just say I reached out to Samuel because I know he takes a different perspective on a lot of these issues than what you might come across in most mainstream let's just say left-leaning media outlets. And because I just absolutely value diversity of thought, I like to listen to different voices. I never want to just sit in an echo chamber because I am trying to understand the race conversation. I want to understand it by listening to a different array of different voices. And so Samuel is going to be part of that array. Some of you, I at the end of the podcast, me and him had a little offline dialogue, and I said, Samuel, I'm going to get three kinds of emails. Number one, I'm going to get several emails probably from people that say, Preston, finally, you had a voice of reason and rationality on the show with your journey in this race conversation. Thank you for having Samuel on. That's going to be some of you. Others of you are going to say, wow, he gave us a lot to think about. I need to kind of rethink some things that I thought were kind of established, and he challenged some assumptions that I had. Thank you for having him on. I need to kind of sit back and fact check some things, read some more articles, and see what I think about this. That's going to be some of you. And others of you might say, I can't believe you platformed this guy. That was absolutely horrible. He's wrong. He's internalized his own racism or something like that. I don't know what kind of response, but what I think some of you are not going to like what he has to say. So I just challenge all of you just to listen, to understand, to engage, to do your own research, to be humble, to consider different viewpoints, and then do your own fact checking, do your own research, so that we can all be well informed, having grappled with a different array of voices, so that we can have a better perspective on something as significant as racism. So without further ado, let's welcome the one and only Samuel Say to Theology in the Raw. Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. I'm here with Samuel Say, whom I only vaguely know from a distance. Read some of your stuff, Samuel, and heard some of your talks, and I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
I want to specifically have you unpack your view on the race conversation. I know that's a broad term, but you have some interesting and some might consider different unorthodox maybe thoughts on the race conversation. But first, why don't you tell us who you are and give us a little bit of background about kind of where you're coming from, and then we can get into some of the nitty gritty.
Yeah. So I'm Samuel Say. I blog at slowtowrite.com. I'm on social media also at slowtowrite. I'm known primarily for two things. I'm known for being a pro-life advocate. Until recently, I was working for an organization here in Canada on trying to end abortion in our nation. And then I'm also known for blogging about racial issues, cultural issues, political issues with, I would say, biblical theology. But I was born originally in Ghana, West Africa, and I moved to Canada when I was 10 years old. Originally, I lived in Montreal, basically the French city in Canada, and then I moved to Toronto when I was about 13, and now I'm in the middle of moving to the U.S. Soon. I have a fiance. I got to marry. So,
will you become a citizen or start that path, or?
Doing that, yes.
Okay.
When it would take me a few years before I can apply for that, but when I'm able to, yes, yeah.
Is Ghana French speaking? I forget.
No, it's English. We're a British colony, but
Okay.
We just moved to Montreal because at the time it was just the easiest place for us to settle.
So did you learn French in Montreal then, or?
Yes, I did. Although unfortunately, so when I spoke it almost fluently within 3 years. I was young, and the younger you are, the easier you can understand the language. And I'm generally pretty good at languages, anyways. But then when I moved to Toronto, for the last 20 years, it's been 20 years now, I rarely spoke French to anybody really.
Okay.
So I can still understand a lot of it, but I can't speak it as easily as I
Okay.
used to.
Yeah. My wife was born and raised in France, so that's yeah.
Oh, okay.
But I've dabbled in French mainly for my doctorate. We had to read French and German among other
Oh,
languages, so I was able to kind of get a okay reading knowledge. But man, reading French and speaking it are two different worlds.
yes, 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 yes.
And were you raised in a Christian home, or when did you come to faith? Or
Yeah, sorry. I was raised by a Christian mom. So she was well, she is a single mother still, but I was raised in a single parent home. My dad wasn't in the picture at all. He left before I was born,
okay,
and he moved to Nigeria, and no one knows where he's at since then. I only
wow,
mentioned that because my mom was both my mom and my dad, essentially, in a sense, like being the breadwinner and
yeah,
the just keeping the home. So just seeing how she maintained her faith in adversity like that really had a big impact on me.
yeah,
Yeah. But seeing her faith, seeing how um, how she persevered through a lot of trials and adversity, even seeing all that, I had a good idea who God was, but I loved my sin. I knew as early as 5 years old that I was a child of wrath. It was pretty easy to see I was very sinful. Still am very sinful. Um, but while I was always convicted of sin and I knew I needed to repent, I never did. I loved my sin too much. It wasn't until I was 19 at a youth retreat at church. So some good things do happen at youth retreats. So um, they preached the gospel, and I'll tell you. So this was actually a prosperity gospel church. This is
huh,
that's how I grew up. So it was not a very good preaching of the gospel whatsoever. But they preached. The pastor simply said Christ died for sinners,
huh,
and just like that. Though I heard that many times before, I was like, I'm a sinner. Um, like that's me.
mm-hmm.
And then right away I was born again, and I believed in Christ. I loved Christ, and I hated my sin. And since then, I've been following him.
Okay, awesome. Well, man, that's a beautiful story. Yeah, sometimes the gospel can be preached in context where you wouldn't expect it, and God works through mysterious ways. I've got many of those kinds of stories along the way in my own journey. But let's dive into the race conversation. I'm not even sure how to set it up, but I guess just say, hey, would love to hear your. I know you've done a lot of thinking about various things. I'm particularly interested in how we should understand racism, racial tensions, even things like systemic racism, or even more specifically, I know you've written on critical race theory and things that I've had other people on the podcast talking about. But however you want to jump in, yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on how you think through the very volatile race conversation happening today.
Mhm. Yeah. So just before I start, I think some of the audience might be thinking, well, wait a minute, he's a black Canadian. How do you navigate all that? Well, just to give people a background as to just the two nations, Canada and America have somewhat of a different history concerning slavery. We also had slavery here. We had segregation here as well too. They're very similar. The only difference is it wasn't anywhere near as severe
Okay.
in Canada as it was in the U.S. Right? I mean, Canada was as Martin Luther King Jr. said that it was the promised land, in that was where a lot of it was the Underground Railroad was not just leading to North America, or Northern America, I should say, the northern states, but also primarily in Canada.
Huh.
So a lot
Okay.
of Black Canadians here originally were basically running from slavery from the U.S.
Okay.
Nevertheless, when they came here, still had some segregation here as well too, even near Toronto where I'm at, but not quite as severe as it
Okay.
was. So
Yeah.
um, but because of the similar histories, though different in scope, a lot of the same issues persist here.
Okay.
We have the same disparities. So, for example, in Toronto, 70% of the police shootings are against Black people.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's even higher than, as far as I know, anywhere else in the U.S. So we have a lot of the same. We have Black Lives Matter, Toronto here, and I would say they're probably the more radical group actually of the entire chapters.
Okay.
Because they have, of course, chapters in the U.S. and in UK and Canada, and
Yeah.
the Canadian one is pretty radical.
That's really
Um,
helpful because I think our the American perception of Canada is that you guys are so progressive that these kind of justice issues don't they've been eradicated for the most part. Yeah.
well, you see, and that's the thing. That's what I try to warn Americans is that yes, progressivism is a major aspect of Black Lives Matter. They are a progressive group, but that there's I would say it's unending. They want complete. I mean, and they would say this. They want a completely anti-Western society. They want a revolution, and until that happens, um, that will not be enough. Which is why Black Lives Matter and critical race theory is still very prominent here. Just right now, I'm working on an article about how my local school district board is pushing intense critical race theory in the school, so much that I have several teachers who are within the school board who are messaging me saying, "Hey, man, like, can you expose what's happening here because it's pretty bad." And recently, I spoke at a Canadian Christian university, and I guess they didn't know what I would say. I didn't lie to them; they just asked me to come speak. And then when I spoke there, I guess they thought that I was going to be pushing critical race theory or agreeing with their views. I didn't know what their views were necessarily. I had an idea, but I was like, well, they invited me, so let me just come speak. And the title of the talk was simply, "What is racism?" And I just defined what biblical racism or what racism is biblically. And Afterward, they sent a public letter denouncing me um, for for basically defending racism and for being anti-black and anti, people of color. Now, um, as you can tell, I'm a black man, so
I
so
was gonna
for me,
ask. I was wondering.
exactly. Yeah, so for me to be labeled anti-black is quite interesting, although I've been hearing that a lot these days.
Yeah.
So all these issues are still very much prominent in Canada.
Okay.
Even right now, actually, there's a movement. We have our Independence Day of sorts on July 1st called Canada Day. There's a movement called Cancel Canada Day because of our history of oppression in the past against people of color, especially the indigenous people here. So you have a lot of the Black Lives Matter, critical race theories guys within Canada pushing to make Canadians not celebrate our Independence Day.
Okay. Well, now I'm curious with that talk you gave. Can you give us the snapshot of what you said in your talk that caused you to be accused of being anti-black?
Yes. So if you don't mind, actually, I can just read a quick
Yeah.
um, text. That's what I started with, and I think it's just helpful. That's what I always want to start with when it comes to the issue of racism.
Mm-hmm.
So, sorry. Okay, so it's 2 Timothy 3:12. I'll just start there. Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted, while evil people and impostors will go from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. But as for you, continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it. And from childhood you have been acquainted with sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. And here's a key part for the talk.
Mm-hmm.
All scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned that because I said, look, if you want to be truly anti-racist, if you want to share what God says about racism, if you want to understand what racism is, what justice is, how to love black people, the greatest book you can have in the world for that is this, because the scriptures are sufficient. They are able to make you wise. It makes you competent for every good work. Then I said, look, biblically, according to the Bible, and also particularly James 2, verse 1 to 4, racism is simply partiality against someone. It's bias against someone. It's not a unique sin. It's a more particular type of partiality. It is partiality or bias against someone because of their skin color. Therefore, theologically, it's no different than me showing partiality against you because of your skin color, Preston, or because You might be taller than me. You might be shorter than me. You might be, you're in better shape than I am in, right? If I show partiality against you because you are in great shape, well, it's the exact same sin as racism, right? Which is offensive to people because people say, wait a minute, well, there's historical oppression and everything. I was like, well, that's true. We can acknowledge that. But before God, when a racist faces God, it will be judged for partiality. And when I go before God, I will be judged for partiality too in different ways. All right. So I explained that. And then I mentioned that, therefore, if we are going to claim that our nation, Canada or America, is systemically racist, biblically as Christians, we need to give evidence of partiality within the system, not by outcome, right, but by intent. Because as James says, partiality is to make distinctions between people. It is always by motivation and intent. So I can't judge racism based by perception or by how it makes me feel or by outcome. It's by someone's intention in what they were doing.
So that's helpful. Because I'm just trying to understand the conversation. As I understand it, the argument for systemic racism is based at least partially, if not fully, in unequal outcomes. Is that correct? That among the Black community in particular, not necessarily people of color, because Asian Americans always throw a wrench into that, or even first generation immigrant. I mean, you yourself are an immigrant. From what I've heard, the outcome for first generation immigrants, even from Africa or whatever, is still different than people who are African American, have been in America for a long time. And if I say anything that needs to be let me tell my audience, everything I'm saying fact checked. I'm just recalling from stuff I've read, so it may or may not be correct. You guys need to do your own research. But as the argument goes, because there is unequal outcome in terms of poverty, crime rates, whatever, among the Black community in particular, therefore there's something systemically wrong, or there's something wrong with the very systems, the structures in place. Is that, am I representing that argument well? And then that's what you're arguing against?
That is a major part of the argument. The argument is just, they would say, really just perception as well too. There could be, so for example, when it comes to the law, when it comes to the nation, the system itself, that is the argument. But they would even say that even things like certain businesses, right, or even churches, that even if you have even if you don't have equality, even if you have no disparities, if certain people do not feel included in certain things, right, could be that. Or for example, if there's a church where you have a diversity in the members, but you don't have a voice for Black people within the leadership, for example, that could be seen as being systemically racist. So it can be meant not just in terms of disparities as the biggest part, but the other thing is more so also perceptions, which I think is a major problem, because then what's the authority on what is truly racist and what isn't? Right, which is what you have to go by. I would say, I don't think it's me saying it. I think it's the Bible, is that we should be slow to speak and we should be quick to listen. We should be hoping all things and believing all things, right? If there's certain things that could seem like they're racist when they're not really, if we look into it. So if you were to say something to me that were to, so for example, if you asked me, as you did earlier, well, where are you from? That could be seen as being racist, because, well, what do you mean, where am I from? Why wouldn't you assume that I'm just born, in Canada? Which believe me, it's actually, they would call that a microaggression, right? And I know you weren't doing that, right? I know the question is fine, but because of some people, sorry.
Yeah.
Some people have experienced genuine, like actual racists saying, well, you don't belong here. Where are you from? Right?
Yeah.
Because of that, well, you're doing that for the very same thing when you're not. So then I have to assume, I have to obey what God calls me to do, which is to hope all things, to believe all things, that let me assume the best of you, essentially. Now, concerning the disparity argument for racism, well, that creates a lot of problems. So, for example, there's Thomas Sowell. I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Sowell, but I admire him a lot. He mentions that people from the same household do have unequal outcomes, right? And it's true. So my older brother, for example, He and I were raised by the same parent, our mom, but he has a lot more money than I do. He's doing a lot better in life than I am, right? Is that because my mom was showing partiality against me and favoring him? No, is that different people have different outcomes. Different trees bear different fruits.
Mm.
Then one example that I always use is the parable of talents, for example, where you have the master giving the three different servants different talents, right? He gave the first talent. So if he gave the first servant 5 talents, he gave the second servant 2 talents. He gave the third servant 1 talent. In the end, not to go through the whole parable, but in the end, the first two were able to double make a profit. The first one didn't, and he's punished by the servant.
Mm.
Well, if we then let's assume then that the third servant is a black man. Now, all of a sudden, if we believe that disparities are is evidence of injustice,
Mm.
then we would have to believe that the master who is supposed to represent Christ in that parable is unjust because it just happens to be that the black man is the third person who received less money than everybody else. And even in heaven, for example, there will be disparities in heaven. Now, I'm not saying it will be racial, but there will be disparities. There's no equality of outcome. And biblically, you don't see equality of outcome being seen as evidence of justice,
Mm.
right? And even when it comes to equality of outcome, sorry if I'm talking too much.
No, no, no. That's why you're here.
Even when it comes to equality of outcome, within black people, you actually have disparities. So immigrants actually are actually doing better socioeconomically than even white Americans and white Canadians. The Ghanaians, Nigerians, the West Africans, which I'm a member of, financially or economically, we're doing better.
Then what?
Well,
Then even white Americans, you're saying?
yes, than even white Americans.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah.
Huh.
So then the question is, well, why is that? Right? Is it because of is it disparities because of skin color, or is it because of several factors? And I would say the biggest factor there, and this is I wrote an article on my blog, not to promote it, but it was called "Our Fathers Are Failures," where I use my own story and experiences to mention that the biggest issue facing Black people, the biggest disparity, is fatherlessness. Right? So the gap between in is similar also in Canada as well. In America, um, black children grow up without fathers at a rate of 75%. So 75% of black children do not have their fathers in the home. 75%. Well, compared to white Americans, it's actually the complete opposite, where it's only 25% of them who do not have their fathers in the home.
Hmm.
That's too much as well, too.
Yeah.
But you have a 50% gap between that. That's going to lead to other things. Barack Obama himself said before he became president, the biggest issue facing Black Americans is fatherlessness,
Hmm.
because, and every study shows this, fatherless children are much more likely to not graduate from high school, which was me, are much more likely to become criminals, or at least be indulging in criminal activity, which was me, to be much more violent, to have early sexual activity, which is me, which leads to, of course, them repeating the same issue in terms of creating more fatherless homes and everything else. So these are the biggest issues, and it's true that if you do not graduate from high school, you're not going to be doing as well as your
Yeah.
peers.
What do you say? Because, and again, I'll say it one more time, then I'll stop qualifying my questions. But I'm reflecting on something I heard somewhere, whatever. So again, if it's accurate, then great. If not, then please fact check me. Um,
Mhm.
I've heard people say that yes, all that's true, but even that is due to certain structures left over, from segregation and redlining and zoning and clustering poor Black people in certain neighborhoods and preventing them. So even that outcome of fatherlessness is partially due to unjust structures, whether they're still in place or maybe they're left over from a previous era
Yeah,
that was unjust. Is that an accurate
that was the
representation, or what would
main
you
argument.
say to that?
Yeah. No, you're right. That's the main argument.
Okay.
Why I think that's wrong is actually because, and I explained this in the article I mentioned, "Our Fathers Are Failures," on my blog. But initially, actually, when slavery was ended for the next several 30, 40 decades, sorry, 30, 40 years, you actually had more black men in the home than white men in the home. You
Oh
had
wow.
like it was a much greater rate of black fathers staying in the home than white fathers. And think about it, right? That's because, well, in slavery, you didn't have a right to your family. So when they were finally freed, they cherished the idea of the family because now they had something of their own. They were the heads of their families and leading their wives and leading their children. But it wasn't really till you see the first cracks of that changing with the New Deal by FDR, where you see the government playing a role in creating a little bit the first stages of the, I guess, the welfare system, and then especially 1960s. That's when you see a huge rise, and that was really with when LBJ introduced the Great Society, where he was actually warned by some of his own people in his party, saying, "Hey, like what you're about to do, we're already seeing trends of because of the government trying to help black communities are actually leading more black men away from the home. So if you implement this, you're actually going to end up perhaps accelerating this to making it to creating a disaster." And right when you had the Great Society in the late, I think it was 68 when it started, that's when you had a massive, massive rise in fatherlessness within black families. So I would say that's not the main reason. But also, even in Canada and the UK, so I mentioned this in the article, in Canada, we don't have quite the same history, as I said before, as Americans. And yet, the fatherlessness rate here is almost identical to what it is in America, as it is also in the UK as well. So if America's history with slavery and segregation is the main issue, then why then would it be that even at the height of segregation and slavery, well, right after the segregation and slavery, you had more black men in the home than now, right? And then even, of course, again with Canada and in the UK, where those histories aren't quite the same, you have the same disparities as well too. So I think those examples dispel the idea that it is America's history with slavery and segregation that is the cause of fatherlessness.
So just to summarize, so at the end of the '60s in particular, fatherlessness was way way lower than it is now. So and no
Significant.
nobody would say we're more racist now than we were in the late '60s, right? Or maybe some people say that.
Some critical race theorists actually say that,
I mean,
but generally,
only a white person could say that. Like, I've heard people say that, like, things are worse now than under segregation. I'm like, you're white, right?
yeah.
I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
well, some of them say some critical race theorists say that because the disparities now worldwide, I mean not worldwide, but universally in America, are much much worse than they were in the '60s, which
Oh,
is shocking. But
yeah.
like socioeconomic disparities between Black Americans and white Americans today is significantly worse than it was in the '60s. So that's a good question. Well, why is that, right? If racism is much, I mean, if it's much more rare than it is then, which is just proven, right? The numbers prove it. The attitudes, it's a fact. But because of the disparities, critical race theorists say, well, then, or people who support Black Lives Matter, they say, well, that can't be the case then. And that's one
Oh,
of the problems with believing that disparities is evidence of racism. If you believe that, then that becomes a foundation to
okay.
how you define racism, right? So even though
Yeah,
things
that makes sense.
are clearly better, again, the numbers show this across the board, because of the disparities when it comes to outcome,
Okay.
they maintain that it has to be worse or the same.
So what is the answer then? Why is there such a high rate of fatherlessness? I think, I mean, poverty and criminal activity. Would that be accurate too? That has
Yeah,
increased among the black community more than other communities. And
yeah.
if that's true, then why, if it's not racism or systemic racism, what is it then? Um,
A lot of it is just the government, right? So with the Great Society, which is why it's fascinating right now when many critical race theorists or many just people in general to talk about reparations being needed. Well, the irony of it, that well, it's not really ironic, but it's interesting because the Great Society was deemed as a form of reparations for Black people. So LBJ and the Democrats, they very much targeted pushing the Great Society, the war on poverty, and things like that for the black community by introducing the welfare system, particularly to help, of course, the poor, all people, but particularly also dealing with black people to help them because they believed that if they were to create the welfare system, it would be a means of paying back the injustices through slavery and segregation. But the welfare system completely just has harmed the black families and white families too, but especially the black family. When you target or when you try to help out one particular group in that way, and that one particular group has been the one that's been most affected by it in the ways, that's of course a sign of how bad that what's the word that project was.
Yeah.
So is the welfare system playing a big role, and you see that too over here in Canada, where again similar history but not quite as severe, and yet the welfare system is absolutely. And I know many people. I grew up in the welfare system, and I see how it affects black families, especially because naturally, if you have a man in the home, well, then you can't get as much support from the government, right? And it creates this idea then, well, and I know many families, some relatives of mine, who will divorce just so they can get the welfare system, or who will refuse to remarry or to bring in their men. Now, of course, not everyone does this, but for many cases, they're like, well, if you come in and then we don't have the government backing anymore, then what's the point of you coming in? Which, of course, harms the children.
Wow. This is exactly what Shelby Steele argues in his book, White Guilt. Are you familiar with that? And again, I'm as I've said offline, I'm coming at this whole conversation as a learner. I'm just absorbing different viewpoints and stuff. So I read people across the board. Okay, I read D'Angelo and Kendi, and I've read Shelby Steele and Glenn Lowry, and very different kind of opinions. But I would say I read Shelby Steele alongside D'Angelo's book, White Fragility, and my anecdotal experience is, I thought D'Angelo's book was just horribly argued. Maybe she's right, her conclusion. I just thought the argument was hideous. Just it wouldn't fly in any kind of like legitimate academic setting with any kind of alternative viewpoints. It was just the logic of it was I just thought it was unconvincing. And again, maybe our conclusion's right. I can care less about that. Really, as an academic, I like to look at how people get there and how they're building evidence and logical connections. And that was she would have failed my class. But Shelby Steele's book, I don't know. I was much more convinced by it. And certainly a black man writing about his experience growing up in segregation is going to carry more weight than a white lady who says that she, is already skittish around black people and has racism coming out of her. I'm like, girl, you got problems, man. Like, I don't know.
Or they also, sorry not to cut you off, but she also suggested that guys like Martin Luther King Jr. and Barack Obama are actually racist too, especially Martin Luther King, as many critical race theories do, because Martin Luther King believed, of course, in the famous words of not judging people by their color, but by the content not by their color, but by their character.
Yeah.
Well, critical race theories like Robin DiAngelo believe that in itself is racist now, because the whole goal, remember, of that, which is, again, it's so important that I keep saying this, because if we accept the belief that racial disparities are evidence of racial discrimination, therefore, the only way then to end discrimination is to end disparities. Right? And then that creates a problem. Well, that's why not Robin DiAngelo, but her colleague Ibram Kendi says racial inequality, so racial discrimination is wrong only if it leads to racial discrimination, so racial disparities. Right? Let me say, sorry, I'm getting myself confused here, so I'll say it again.
Yeah.
That he was saying that racial discrimination is only wrong if it leads to racial disparities. However, racial discrimination is good if it leads to racial equity or racial parity.
Wow.
That's what he's saying here, which means that since white people across the board are more privileged than black people, therefore you need then to discriminate against white people systemically. That way, by bringing them down, you could have more equality, or by bringing them down, you could have, in his mind, black people coming up. right? So that's the problem with thinking that disparities in of itself proves discrimination, which is why I say that the Bible is a lot better in giving us
Huh.
wisdom on this, right? That partiality or racism, discrimination is by intent, not by outcome,
Well,
right? Because
what
then,
about unconscious bias? So, because yeah, yeah, of course, if there is intent, clear acts of racism, we're all going to say that's wrong. But what if people are acting out of just implicit bias? And of course, you can't really. How do you prove that? Maybe you can't. But is there a place to acknowledge that? Say a business guy's CEO, he's white, all his friends are white, and he was inherited wealth, and he hires a lot of white people, and that's his whole network. And black person applies for the job. Maybe he's on paper just as qualified as the next guy. Could there not be a place for him? Not really out of overt, like I hate black people, but just like unconsciously hiring white people over black people. Is that? And I'm kind of just asking the question out loud. I mean, I don't know if I'm
yeah,
framing it right or if that's even a helpful
yeah, I
place to go.
understand you, and I'm grateful for your question. It's a good question. It's a very important question. So the problem with that is the word bias itself requires you to be conscious to be biased,
Huh.
right? Especially as it deals with partiality. Um, so I don't know if you can hear that the thunderstorms around here,
Oh, that's right.
but but like so the word partiality is like it's intentional, right? Now, I was a Christian first. Now I'm happy to talk about the logical aspects of unconscious bias, but as a Christian, like bias is partiality, and that as James describes it, it
Mhm.
is never unconscious. It's always by intention. You are always making distinctions between people, right? So if we're going to, because then biblically, say within the church, if someone is guilty of unconscious bias, well, how do you prove it? How do you
Yeah.
do Matthew 18, right? And that should be true for everybody else. I don't want someone assuming the worst of me, right? I want someone to assume the best of me as God calls them to hope all things, to believe all things. Yeah, and the problem with unconscious bias is, as I said earlier, you can't prove it. And the issue is biblically, um, or even just morally general. If you accuse someone of something and you can't prove it, you're the one who's in sin. You're the one who's in wrong. You're the one who's showing bias. So just to give you an example, um, I was walking, and I always share this example many times. So I was walking in a dark tunnel once. It was a winter. This is a very dark tunnel, and it's in a very isolated, area in my neighborhood. I'm walking this tunnel, and then as I'm walking there, I see this young lady on the other end of the tunnel. She's a young white woman, small woman, very petite, and as soon as she sees me, she just freezes up, and she looks terrified.
Huh.
And then I'm a big man. I'm a big black man. So she sees me and she's terrified. And then now the walls in this tunnel are pretty dirty. She essentially attaches herself to the tunnel, and just clutches her purse and just speed walks fast away from me. And immediately I'm thinking, man, yet again, happening again. I'm a black man. A white woman sees me. She's terrified of me. She thinks because I'm black, I'm going to harm her. And here we are again. Then as I'm walking, I think to myself, well, wait a minute, wait a minute. Is it because I'm black? Like, let me think about this. Well, what if I actually do what God calls me to do, which is to, again, hope all things, believe all things, assume the best of her, and to consider her as more significant than myself, as Philippians tells me to do. And I think, well, what if she's actually a victim of sexual assault in the past? And when she sees me, now she's just afraid and she's vulnerable. What if she's doing as I've told my little what's the word, sister to do, which is that it's women are vulnerable in that tunnel. So I told my sister that, look, every time you're in that tunnel and you see a man, just be careful. What if she's just doing what I've told others to do?
Hmm.
And then I'm thinking, well, what if it was a black woman and she did the same thing? Would I think she was racist? I
Hmm.
wouldn't think that at all. And then I thought, wait a minute, I'm doing what I'm accusing her of doing against me, which is if she wasn't a white person, I wouldn't assume she was being racist. I'm assuming she's being racist when I'm actually the one who's being racist there. Now, she might be a racist. She might be.
Yeah.
but it's not my job to assume the motives of why people do what they do.
Hmm.
But it's my job to discern my own motives.
Mm-hmm.
So could she be a racist? Maybe, but I know for sure that I am. And God calls me to assume the best of people. And
Hmm.
that's the issue with unconscious bias, that in determining that, we are actually assuming, like we are using our own bias to determine others of being unconsciously biased, because it's always directed towards white people, not black people, right? So that's the issue with that whole
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's helpful. And like you said, maybe she's racist. Like that's one of several possibilities, right?
mhm.
But to assume that is, you're saying that's going beyond what Scripture kind of allows believers to do. Really, that's good. Have you experienced like what you would call overt racism, where it's like,
Oh,
no doubt about this was a racist comment, act, whatever?
oh, for sure. I experienced that. Um, Actually, I've experienced that in different ways, but particularly at school, one of my teachers was brutally racist towards me for an entire year,
Huh.
um, where um, he would in front of the whole class, and at the time, and today it would never fly, but at the
Yeah.
time, people would just laugh along with him, and I wasn't laughing, but I didn't really know how to address it. Um, but yeah, he would use racial slurs against me, make fun of how dark I was,
Wow.
make fun of where I come from, Africa,
Hmm.
routinely teasing me and showing obvious partiality against me in other ways as well too. That was the worst form. That was hard for me.
Yeah.
I didn't want to go to school. I don't want to go to class because of that.
Hmm.
I was also a bit embarrassed too because interestingly, a lot of my black friends, well, not black friends, but black classmates were laughing along with it,
Hmm.
because in particular he was making fun of not just I was a black person, but I was an African black person, and
Huh.
I'm darker than the average black person. And since a lot of those guys were not as dark as I was, they were laughing along. If anything,
Wow.
there were actually people who would repeat what he would say to me, in the hallway and things like that. So I've definitely experienced that before. I've experienced other forms as well too. But to me, I think the kind of racism that we don't talk about a lot these days is, you know, um, recently there was a prominent Christian leader who mentioned that a lot of his black friends do not trust him because he's white, because they've experienced racism before, or people that they know have experienced racism before. So he said that it's understandable that they don't trust him. Well, that's actually racism, what he's saying.
Hmm.
And we wouldn't think of it that way, but it's actually I would say these days, or especially within the church, it's one of the most destructive forms of racism. Because if a white person says that, if a white person says, um, yeah, I myself have experienced racism from black people or some harm from black people, and because of that, I just don't trust black people. We would say, well, that's racism. You shouldn't judge that black friend or that black person based on what others have done to you. Well, the issue why that's racism is because the Bible calls us not to rejoice at wrongdoing,
Hmm.
right? Or not to justify wrongdoing. It's sinful for someone to not trust another person strictly based on what other people have done. It's sinful. It's wrong. It's partiality. It's bitterness. So if a white person says it's okay if black people do not trust white people,
Hmm.
you are justifying our sin. You are showing partiality against us because we're black, right? And that's sinful. That's wrong. That's racism.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I've been seeing that a lot,
Hmm.
that where I know that I can get away with certain things as a black person that white people wouldn't get away with. That if a white person would say that they would be called to repent, which is love, right?
Hmm.
It's loving to call people to repent. So if because I'm black, I will say things that will make you afraid of wanting to rebuke me or to call me to repent, that's racism. That's you choosing not to love me because I'm black.
Yeah.
And it's a very major issue, I think, within the church today that we're not addressing.
Wow. Wow. No, that's thanks for always bringing it back to the Bible. It's fascinating how the Bible often isn't, I don't know, consulted in race conversations. Not that's overstatement, but in many, even across in Christian circles sometimes. So that's, yeah, that's super helpful. I'm curious about the concept of white privilege. Do you have thoughts? I love when asking a question, you kind of crack up like, yes, Preston. You didn't read my blog on that, did you?
No, it's okay.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that concept? I mean, we hear that all the time, and I honestly don't know what I'm thinking through it,
Yeah.
Well, I will say, well, no, I'll let you answer. Then I might throw in some of my thoughts on it.
No problem.
Yeah.
So if what they meant by it was strictly to say, it just happens to be that white people are more privileged than black people because of majority culture, maybe, a number of different things. If that's just what they meant by that, I wouldn't phrase it that way, but I say, okay, yeah, well, that's true. It's true that being part of a majority, I won't call it a majority culture, but just you see more white people in America and Canada than you do black people, right? It's, and there are some cultural differences necessarily. So if that was the case, I would say I agree with that generally. But white privilege basically means because systemic racism exists, it naturally leads to an easier life for black people. Sorry, for white people. And that it was designed that way within our founding principles, and that it's maintained through our founding principles, and it will be so unless you abolish systemic racism, which then leads to a change in the culture. So generally, white privilege can mean anything like just the socioeconomic status is primarily that. So it usually deals with the disparities angle as well too, or just what they would call as cultural norms and things like that benefit white people, they would say. Well, the problem with that is, again, it assumes a lot. It makes a lot of assumptions. And again, the data itself as well too, there are several variables within that. As I mentioned earlier, West Africans or African immigrants are, if you look at just how they phrase it, at least by socioeconomic statuses, they are much more privileged than white people are, as are Asian Americans. Now they would say things like the lack of diversity might be evidence of white privilege. Well, I don't think so, because they're just a bigger population. In the same way that where I'm from, Ghana, for example, I'm a member of my tribe. We're called the Fantis. We are a smaller tribe. The bigger tribe is our rivals, the Ashantis. Now, the Ashantis, they dominate Ghanaian culture. And no one says, well, that's just Ashanti privilege. It's just the fact that they're just a bigger population, just the way it is. Anywhere you go, you're going to have a more dominant group just because of the population size.
Okay.
So I reject what white privilege, because it assumes there is a nefarious reason as to why white people today are more generally privileged than the average black person. What I would say, though, is, again, going back to the beginning, I think the biggest reason why white people tend to be more privileged, I suppose, than black people is, again, the fatherlessness issue. So I say there's actually there's a father privilege or a parent's privilege in the world. Is not based on your skin color. And to prove this, for example, white people who grew up without dads have basically the same socioeconomic status as black people who grew up without dads. And then and the black people who grew up with dads have the same socioeconomic status as the white people who do grow up without dads. So
really, that's would people push back on that, or is that pretty established? Or
it's established. Now, some might push back on that, but the numbers show that. Now, of course, it's not the exact same number, but it's eerily similar.
Very close. Wow.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that's super helpful. I think and these are thinking out loud questions that may be totally wrong or wrong-headed, but I don't know, is it right to say we should define privilege too? Is it simply wealth? I mean, or should we measure it mental health and happiness and depression rates? I mean, to say that no, wealth is the goal of life, and it's like, is that a Christian? Does that reflect a Christian view of what privilege even means? But then also, like, when people raise a privilege question, and again, I'm with you, I think there's some legitimacy to it with any majority culture, given especially the history of power differentials and oppression and all this. I mean, I'm going to assume, yes, that probably has some lasting effects in many cases. But when people say, "Do you believe in white privilege?" I'm like, in what context?
Yeah.
Like, it just seems sociologically naive to make such a blanket statement. Like, if I'm a white person trying to be a professional hockey player, or maybe I'm trying to be a hip hop artist, maybe I'm walking through South Central LA at night. Does my whiteness bring me more privilege or less privilege then? Does it, what about my height? If I want to be a basketball player and I'm 5'6", or if I'm a 6'8" black person, which one has more privilege? And these are kind of, everybody's like, yeah, what about? All I'm saying is, it's from my vantage point. Again, maybe I'm totally missing it, but it just seems like to make such a blanket statement that doesn't consider layers and layers and layers and layers. What about if somebody's autistic? What if they're disabled? What if they have a family life, but they were sexually abused by their father? And does that? I think I need to ask like 100 different questions before I determine this person has more privilege than this next individual. I don't know. Am I?
And you're exactly right, and I completely agree with you. I can tell you, playing basketball when I was younger, if you're a white guy, you show up, with my friends in your court, we're gonna make fun of you. We're thinking, oh yeah, this white boy can't play, right? You know what I mean? And many times they could, but we just assume that they can't because they're white, right? Or I can even tell you now, I don't know what your views on, over here in Canada, we're still basically under lockdown essentially with the COVID and everything. I've been making a joke about my black privilege because, especially as a big black man, I don't wear a mask. I don't think I need to, for a number of reasons. Nevertheless, everybody else here is wearing it. I'm an anomaly. Like when I say trust, like it's shocking to people when they see me that I'm wearing a mask. Now I have some friends who are white who don't wear masks, and they tell me all the time how many times they get shouted at and they get called out. Never happened to me. Never happened to me whatsoever. Now I make a joke saying because of my black privilege. Well, right now in today's society, do you really want to be shouting at a black man? Right? It doesn't look good that way, yeah. Right? And I'll tell you this too. This is horrible, but this is what I did when I was younger. This is the power of accusing white people of racism. I knew at 16 years old how powerful it was. As I said before, I was I was not a Christian at the time at all, and I was living a very sinful life. And I attempted to shoplift, at the time, and I got caught. When I got caught, the security guard just approaches me, and right away, almost without thinking, I said, "You're doing this because I'm black." I know that's not why he's doing it, but I knew if I say that, it could help me get from being responsible for my sinful actions, my criminal actions. Right away, I still remember the horror on his face when I said that. And immediately he just said, just drop it and go. He didn't want anything to do with it because of what I just said. Well, if that white person, if you're white and you say that to a black man, that's not going to go anywhere. It's like, whatever. It won't go anywhere. If you're a white person and you're saying that to a white security officer, that's not going anywhere. Because I'm black and I said that, I had the privilege if I say that, who knows, he can get in trouble for that. He doesn't want that whatsoever. Our society hates racism against black people so much that white people are afraid of even being labeled as a racist. So what you're saying, I agree with you. There are different layers to all this stuff that it's completely unjustified and unhelpful to, and even outside of that too. We have, as an immigrant to North America, I can tell you, like I have family members, I have relatives who cannot read their own name. They just can't, because they didn't have the education. What about North American privilege? What about Western privilege, right? If you live in North America already, you are one of the most wealthiest and most educated people in the world. Not just in the world, but in history of the world. What about even era privilege? There's all these different blessings and all these things that we don't think about, but instead we're really just bitter. And we're trying to say, it's really envy. This person has more than me. Okay, well, somebody else would say that they have less than you. So what's the point? Right? Let's just be grateful for what we have. Let's
Huh.
count every blessing. Let's count every one of our blessings or privileges,
Yeah.
instead of trying to check our
Yeah.
privilege as a way of um, of accusing others
Yeah.
of being basically oppressors
Yeah.
against the oppressed.
That's good. Wow. Going back to something you said earlier, what do you think about the criminal justice system? Do you know? I know nothing about that, but have heard that there are sort of biases against black people in particular, at least in the American criminal justice system. Do you know enough to
Yeah,
about it to say anything about that, or even yeah?
yeah.
All right, the one
Um,
example I've been given is like if you get busted for cocaine, which is typically a white man's drug, you're gonna get way less of a sentence than getting busted for crack, which is the same substance but a lesser grade.
yeah.
To me, that's more of a socioeconomic disparity, not necessarily a racial one. I think, but I don't know.
The irony of that is, so we the very same arguments are true here as well too. We have very similar disparities and things like that over here. Actually, disparities here in some ways are actually worse than it is in America. Um, but the issue with that is the reason why crack itself is more receives more severe punishment is because you have the Black Caucus, within the Democratic Party and black leaders themselves who said, let's make that actually more severe because it was harming more black people. So that's the irony of it all,
Huh.
in that the reason why crack, because it was destroying many young black people. So then you have the leaders saying, well, let's put them in jail to warn other it's more severely to warn other black people from following that lifestyle,
Huh.
or to just harming little kids who were being sold these drugs. So that's why you had it much worse than cocaine. Because yeah, the cocaine was an issue in the 80s, but crack itself was destroying black people at a much higher rate. So the irony is,
Wow.
long time you had Reagan being accused of racism because of his inaction against crack. He was being called a racist. They're saying, well, you don't care about black homes. We're being destroyed by this. And you're not doing anything about it. So he
Wow.
was pressured into doing that. Now, Nixon started that. Nixon was also being called racist for that reason as well, too. But then Reagan especially was called racist by the black leaders like Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton. They were all saying this because of the fact that he initially was not focusing on or not just him, but the entire American system was not addressing that issue.
Yeah.
And then also, even now, so people compare crack and cocaine. I get that, but the actual greater comparison is meth and cocaine.
Okay.
And for sorry, meth. I mean, not meth and cocaine, meth and crack, which is meth is the white man's drug, right? So the punishments for meth and crack are actually identical.
Really?
So that's the comparison. Yeah.
That's I have never heard that. Wow. Gosh. What about other aspects of when people say the criminal justice system is bent towards is stacked against black people? Is there other arguments that people use and
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think one very helpful thing when I've mentioned the word critical race theory a lot
Yeah.
today,
Yeah.
and knows what critical race theory is, and I think by helping to define it, it might help people understand where these arguments are coming from, especially as it deals with the criminal justice system. So critical race theory, essentially, to kind of make it very simple, is essentially saying that America's founding principles, America's legal institutions are irredeemably racist
Okay.
because they this is what critical race theorists would say, because they advocate for impartiality when it's impossible. All right, and that's the modernist thinking within it. That they believe that the Western society is really built by and for white white men, really, to oppress women and black people, especially black people. So because of that, they believe that the whole idea of justice as blind is really just a way to manipulate people into thinking that what's truly oppression, discrimination is impartiality and justice. So that's why they believe that racial neutrality is impossible, and it's actually in of itself racist, which is why they claim that MLK himself was internalizing racism.
Huh.
So I think with that in mind, it's helpful to know that the reason why many people say that the system itself is racist is because of the very principles within the system. even before you get to the disparities, they believe that that you should have consideration for someone being black, right? And believing that so that's why you hear you hear arguments about well, black on black crime. Well, the reason why that's happening is not because black people are just committing crimes. It's because the system itself is making them commit crimes. So you should understand that, be compassionate toward that, and give them linear sentences as a kind of reparations as well too. So when people are talking about the outcomes, it's not or the disparities. It's not just the disparities. They think that you should, in many cases, eliminate all that as justice for black people, which is why you hear, of course, too, about abolishing or defunding the police and abolishing even prisons. So Black Lives Matter believe they should abolish prisons in of itself because they don't believe that it's justice, since in their mind it's just a way of trying to enslave black people again. All right. So with all that in the background, I think it's helpful to know that, and then I can talk about the outcomes of disparities as a whole. So the issue again is there's no evidence, right? Disparities do not prove discrimination. There's no evidence that certain black people are being punished more severely as a whole because of their skin color. There's no evidence of that at all. And you've seen several cases where actually there are some times where black people do get a leniency because of, I would say, white guilt in many cases because of that very thing I just told you about. So even right now, when it comes to police shootings, I'm forgetting his name, but there was a researcher who was not on my side, but he's just an honest researcher, and he came with a conclusion, which has been verified by many people, that white cops are actually now less likely to shoot black people because of fear of what they could be labeled as if they do so. So even when they're in dangerous positions, they won't do so sometimes because they're afraid to be called racist and lose their jobs and lose their livelihood. So that's my answer to that.
Wow, gosh. You mentioned earlier some of the quote unquote anti-racism movements, and for people that don't know, the phrase anti-racism is identifying one specific kind of movement or way of thinking that is addressing racism. It's a little bit of a not misnomer, but it's like if people say, "Oh, I'm against racism," well, most people are against racism, but anti-racism is kind of a coined phrase, right? That's promoted by Kendi and D'Angelo and many others. It's from my naive reading, because I've done a lot of reading in MLK, Malcolm X. And when I read more modern approaches in the anti-racism, they do seem different. And sometimes, people will ask me what I think about it, and I'm like, well, I tend to resonate more with like an MLK approach to racism. And people are kind of like, well, yeah, that's what all these people are doing too. I'm like, well, I don't know if they are. Like, it just doesn't feel. And again, I'm just a guy who reads a lot and listens a lot, but it just doesn't seem like it's the same approach. Like, I don't think Kendi, and others would really get along well with MLK, or at least I think they'd have more disagreement than agreement. From that's what it seems like to me. Would that be an accurate? Like, would you resonate with MLK and see a big difference between how some of these other people are addressing racial tensions? Yeah,
I'm definitely more in agreement with MLK and completely opposed to the anti-racist guys. So just to add to your point. They're so antagonistic to the civil rights movement that Ibram Kendi, in the beginning of his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he mentions MLK and trying to emulate MLK when he was younger. And then he says he regrets that because he was actually internalizing racism.
Oh, wow.
Right? Okay. That's how strongly they feel about this. And then Derek Bell, who's the founder of critical race theory, him and the Kimberly Crenshaws and the guys who founded it, they expertly say that they created critical race theory as a reaction against the civil rights movement, because civil rights movement did not go far enough. They simply just ended the laws, but it's like, well, laws itself didn't change anything. You have to change the system, the whole system, to end racism in America. So it's a completely so I describe critical race theory not as the offspring of the civil rights movement, but as the offspring of Marxism and postmodernism.
Wow. a lot of debates about critical race theory. I've had several people on the podcast talking about it, and I still need to go back and I didn't read. Derek Bale has that seminal essay, right? That if people really want to understand, what would be kind of a quick reader if someone says, "I want to understand firsthand what critical race theory is"? Would you recommend Bell? And then there's a introduction to critical race theory, I think, that's pretty.
Yes. If people want to know the beginning, anyways, of critical race theory, that's the essential book. It's several essays from the founders and things like that.
Okay.
It's a hard read. It's very academic.
Okay.
But so that's good. But if they want a simpler version of all of that, like just an average person's, I guess, take on it. Now, this person's not an average person. This person's one of the founders. His name is skipping right now. Oh my goodness, what's his name? Rich Delgado.
That book. Yeah. Didn't he write an introduction to critical race theory or something?
Yeah. So he helped. Yeah, I think that one's just called critical race theory. I think.
Okay.
I think the one you're referring to is the one that Kimberly Crenshaw edited with guys like him.
Okay.
So that's a good one. If you just want their own perspective, that's the book.
Okay.
But if you want also a rebuttal against critical race theory from a Christian perspective that explains what critical race theory is and its theological implications, the best book so far is from Vadi Bokum, Fault Lines. It's Vadi Bokum. Not that it really matters, but he's a black man. He's a black theologian, and it's an incredible book.
That just came out, I think, didn't it? I think it just came out. Yeah.
3-4 months ago.
Yeah. Have you read? What about James Lindsay? Are you familiar with him? I mean, do you think he accurately represents CRT?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's been very influential in in how because for a long time now I was studying critical race theory, but I was explaining more of its Marxist roots, which is evident. I mean, they admit this. Now they don't, but because they know now the kind of the blowback to it. But in their essays, they mentioned this. You have one of their founders, I'm forgetting his name right. I think it's Charles Cook. I think where he has a book called From Class to Race, where he says that here's where Marx was right, here's where he's wrong, and here's how we basically want to correct it by making it not a racial issue. Sorry, not a classism issue, but a racial issue. Nevertheless, James Lindsay, I'm a huge fan of his. His book Cynical Theories is absolutely fundamental as well too. So I'd recommend that as well.
I'm always nervous. I've been a Christian all my life, and oftentimes when somebody just opposes something from the beginning, they don't always represent it well, So I'm always but everything I've heard of Lynn, but see, I haven't done the original work in reading critical race theory, but he seems to be very fair in he seems to be very concerned about representing something well, not just creating a straw man and addressing that. That's my impression, at least from when I hear him talk and everything. What about some on the race conversation? Who have been your biggest influences? You mentioned Thomas Sowell. Shelby Steele came up. Are there other people that you're like, man, I think these guys are really guys or girls doing it well?
Yes. I mentioned Vadi Bokum earlier. Vadi Bokum has had the biggest influence on me.
Okay.
Vadi Bokum, and surprisingly to many people, John MacArthur.
Oh yeah.
John had a very big impact on me. Not because these racial issues, and I want to stress this, it's not a matter of just racial. It's theology. It is what is the foundation to ethics and justice. What is your foundation? If it's from the world, you will be lost and you will embrace all these philosophies. But if it's the Bible, you understand what it is, which is why I started out by reading that text, that the Bible is sufficient. So for me, as a black man, because I had learned from guys like John MacArthur and Paul Washer and Charles Spurgeon on making the Bible your foundation for how you understand everything, when I saw a lot of my black peers embracing these issues, I wanted to think clearly, okay, let me not think with my skin color, but let me think with, my soul, what the Bible says. So John MacArthur had a big influence on me. Owen Strachan, I don't know if many people know him, but he's a scholar, and he has a book coming out, I think next month, called Christianity and Wokeness. I've already read it. I endorsed the book. It's brilliant. It's really, really good.
I have to acknowledge that my audience is gonna totally resonate with you saying the Bible's our ultimate authority. Most of my audience is going to resonate with that, but you're going to completely lose them by mentioning John MacArthur and Owen Strand, unfortunately, and Paul Washer. My audience is probably, I just have to acknowledge that. But I went to John MacArthur's college and seminary, so I was nurtured in the environment, so I know it well. But my commitment to biblical authority has only grown stronger, even though I wouldn't line up with several approaches there. But no, that's
and for what it's worth, while he's had a big influence on me, I naturally don't agree with him on everything. I just like his approach in desiring.
Yeah. And I kind of can't stand a Christianity where if you mention somebody you've been influenced by, people are like, oh, I'm like, measure the content of what a person's saying, not somebody they got it from or the book or whatever. So, I mean, I've got a vast array of influences in my life, some of which I'm like, I might disagree with more than I agree with now, but they had a serious influence on my life. And, I think it's people get all up in arms over different names and stuff. But, yeah, that's funny. Well, Samuel, I've taken enough of your time. You've given us a lot to think about, man. And I'm on a journey and thinking through this, and I hope my audience will think through and you've given us a lot to process. And most of all, man, I just appreciate your humility and thoughtfulness. Like I don't know, you come off as a really authentic dude, so I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Is it okay if I could just read a text?
Absolutely.
Maybe that just I guess it would look. I said no, I couldn't read the Bible. I guess it would look bad. So just quickly, it's been on my mind a lot.
Yeah.
It just might be helpful for people to think through these issues.
Yeah.
So the Bible says in Leviticus 19:15, you shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. So what he's simply saying is, do not show partiality to the rich to harm the poor, nor should you show partiality or favor the poor to harm the rich. And that deals with black people and white people and women and men, everything. So if we obey God's word and if we follow our God who is impartial and shows no favoritism, we'll be fine.
That's a good word, man. That's a good word to end on. Thanks so much, Samuel. Where can people find you? slowtowrite.com, is that right? Or
yeah. You can also find me on social media, Slow to Write, across all social media platforms.
Okay, cool. All right, man. Take care.
Thank you so much.